Rich man refuses to help elderly veteran at the grocery store, but karma intervenes. In the bustling city of Miami, amidst the ever-present hum of traffic and the vibrant, sun-soaked streets, Richard Manning had built a life that many would envy. He lived in an exclusive high-rise overlooking the bay, surrounded by the comforts that only wealth could afford. At 64 years old, Richard was at the peak of his career, having established himself as a successful entrepreneur in the tech industry. His company was a titan, his name recognized in boardrooms and financial circles from coast to coast. He had everything a man could want: luxury cars, private jets, a wardrobe full of bespoke suits, and an elite social circle that allowed him to move in places most could only dream of. Before we can continue, if you support veterans, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. Each day, Richard followed a strict routine: early morning workouts with his personal trainer, meetings with top executives, followed by dinners in upscale restaurants with other influential figures. His life, by all accounts, was perfect, at least on the surface. There was no shortage of people eager to win his favor, no shortage of opportunities to further enrich himself. Richard had become accustomed to a world where everything was handed to him on a silver platter, and his expectations of others were equally high. He had little patience for people who didn't match his level of success, and even less for those who didn't seem to understand the importance of appearances. He had made his way to the top by focusing solely on business, on profits, on numbers, and on building a reputation that would cement his place in the upper echelons of society. Relationships, both personal and professional, were built around mutual gain. There was little room in his life for anything less than calculated interactions. He had long since stopped engaging in casual small talk with people he deemed unimportant, and he only associated with those who could help him get further ahead. Richard's world was meticulously curated, and he moved through it with the confidence of someone who knew they were in control. Even his daily trips to the grocery store, an activity that most would consider mundane, were part of this tightly controlled existence. Richard had a personal shopper who did most of his errands, but occasionally, he ventured out into the world to remind himself that he was still a man of the people, that he could rub elbows with the masses when it suited him. The grocery store was a rare moment of anonymity for him, where he could shop without the pressure of being constantly recognized. It was a small pleasure, a brief escape from the relentless expectations of his work life. On this particular day, he had taken a break from his usual routine to stop by the store near his downtown apartment, not because he needed anything in particular, but because it had become a habit, a way to momentarily shed the weight of his carefully curated existence. The store was modest by his standards, nothing like the upscale markets he usually frequented. The shelves were stocked with everyday items: canned goods, fresh vegetables, and the kind of basic products most people would buy on a weekly basis. For Richard, it was a reminder that there was a world beyond his pristine, high-end circles, a world that was simpler, rougher, and more grounded in the everyday struggles of those who weren't fortunate enough to live as he did. He never paid much attention to the people around him. They were part of the background, mere shapes and shadows in his peripheral vision. His attention was always focused on the task at hand, gathering what little he needed, then retreating back into his world of wealth and privilege. As he navigated the aisles, Richard felt a sense of detachment, as if he were a visitor in this humble space, rather than someone who belonged to it. The fluorescent lights above flickered occasionally, casting harsh shadows on the linoleum floors. The air smelled faintly of produce, mixed with the artificial scent of cleaning supplies. There was a dull hum of conversation around him as people shuffled in and out, their carts full of everyday necessities. To Richard, the whole scene felt almost foreign, and he couldn't shake the sense that he didn't belong here. The ordinary folk seemed so content, so comfortable in their lives, and it reminded him of how disconnected he had become from the world beyond his wealth. He had no desire to make small talk with any of them or acknowledge their presence in any meaningful way. As he moved past the aisles, his eyes scanning the shelves with practiced indifference, Richard's mind was already elsewhere. He thought about an upcoming meeting with a potential investor, a meeting that could lead to the next big merger for his company. He thought about his upcoming vacation to Europe, a trip that would allow him to escape the stress of his business dealings for a while. His thoughts wandered to his pristine yacht docked at the marina and the lavish dinner party he would be hosting later that week. These were the things that mattered to him, the things that filled his days and nights. The idea of helping someone in need, or even acknowledging the struggles of those less fortunate, was foreign to him. He had become so used to his world of comfort and excess that he no longer saw the struggles of others as anything more than a distant curiosity. But even in a world so tightly controlled and curated, the reality of human experience was often unpredictable. That day, as Richard walked through the store, he would come face to face with a situation that would challenge his worldview, and a series of events would unfold that would make him question everything he had taken for granted. It started with a simple moment, a frail, elderly man struggling to manage his groceries. Richard didn't notice him at first, lost in his thoughts as he reached for a carton of milk. But as he made his way toward the checkout, a weak voice broke through the haze of his self-absorbed thoughts. "Excuse me, son," the elderly man called out. Richard glanced up briefly, dismissing the voice with a slight frown. He was used to being approached by people, usually for some trivial request or question. He was in no mood to entertain anyone right now. The elderly man stood at the end of the aisle, his frail hands clutching a bag of groceries. He was clearly struggling to carry his items. His clothes were old but clean, and his weathered face spoke of a life lived in hard times. Richard didn't make eye contact as he walked past, brushing past the man without a second thought. He was in a rush, his mind preoccupied with thoughts of the investor meeting. He was too important, too busy, and certainly too wealthy to stop for someone like this. But then something unexpected happened. As Richard rounded the corner to the next aisle, he felt something light brush against his foot. He looked down and saw his leather wallet, fat with cash and credit cards, lying on the floor in front of him. He must have dropped it without noticing. He bent down to retrieve it, and just as his fingers brushed against the leather, an elderly hand appeared in his vision. It was the frail man, leaning down slowly to help him pick up the wallet. The moment was jarring. Richard's first instinct was to pull away, to tell the man he didn't need help. But something stopped him, a small, fleeting moment of hesitation. Maybe it was the suddenness of the encounter, or perhaps it was the realization that his behavior had been less than courteous. As the veteran handed him the wallet, their eyes met for the first time. The old man's gaze was steady, but there was a quiet sadness in his eyes that had seen a lifetime of struggle. Richard took the wallet with a muttered thanks, embarrassed by his own dismissive attitude just moments before. The man nodded, but his voice was calm and gentle as he spoke. "Thank you, young man," he said, his words surprisingly soft despite his rough appearance. "It's not often I get to help someone, especially someone like you." Richard, still flustered, didn't know how to respond. He was used to people helping him, not the other way around. His comfortable world had left him unprepared for moments like this. Still, he gave a half-hearted smile, brushed past the man, and made his way to the checkout. But just as he reached the counter, something in him shifted. The elderly man's words lingered in his mind. "Someone like you." Richard paused, his hand hovering over the credit card scanner. The idea of his own wealth and privilege felt more like a burden than a blessing in that moment, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a pang of guilt. Richard Manning had spent the better part of his adult life building an empire, creating a world that catered to his every need and desire. At 64, he had achieved everything he thought he could ever want: success, luxury, power, influence. But as he stood at the checkout counter in the grocery store, something unexpected had begun to gnaw at him, a quiet discomfort that he couldn't quite shake. It wasn't the first time he had brushed off the suffering or struggles of others, but the elderly man in the store had planted a seed of unease, one that began to sprout with an intensity he had never experienced before. For years, Richard had been operating within the confines of his comfort zone, surrounded by an ever-present bubble of wealth and privilege. He had been raised to believe that the pursuit of personal success was the highest virtue, that a life of hard work, ambition, and shrewd business moves would grant him everything he needed. And it had. He had never questioned the path he was on, never considered the idea that his vast wealth could be a double-edged sword. As far as Richard was concerned, the world revolved around people like him, those who were capable, driven, and relentless in their pursuit of success. Others, people who couldn't afford to live the same lifestyle, were simply on a different path, one that didn't concern him. But today, that had all started to change. The brief encounter with the elderly man who had quietly assisted Richard with retrieving his dropped wallet had triggered a subtle shift in Richard's perception. When the man had spoken, "It's not often I get to help someone, especially someone like you," Richard had dismissed it with a fleeting thought, thinking it nothing more than the ramblings of an older, lonely man. But as Richard stood there, holding his groceries, an unsettling realization began to dawn on him. The man had seen something that Richard had never really acknowledged in himself before. He had seen the difference between them, the gulf that separated the world Richard lived in from the one that the elderly man inhabited. For the first time, Richard began to question the life he had built, and more importantly, the choices that had led him to this point. The thought of the veteran's tired face lingered in his mind, his slow, deliberate movements as he had bent down to pick up the wallet. Richard had moved so quickly, so reflexively, as if he were the center of the universe. But the old man had moved with a quiet patience, as if his time, however limited it might be, was to be spent with purpose, not wasted in the hustle of a life he could no longer keep up with. Richard had never stopped to think about how the elderly man must have felt, struggling with his groceries and moving through the aisles in a way that made him look almost invisible to everyone around him. It was a stark contrast to Richard's own sense of invulnerability, his own belief that the world was meant to cater to his every whim. And yet, there was something about the exchange that stirred a sense of discomfort within him. He hadn't helped the man. He had simply taken what was given to him. He hadn't stopped to ask if the veteran needed help. He hadn't even offered a second glance as he passed him by. The old man's words, however, were like a mirror reflecting back an image that Richard didn't recognize. It wasn't just a reflection of his wealth, his power, or his success. It was a reflection of his isolation, his indifference to the suffering of others, his failure to see the humanity in people he deemed less important than himself. Richard had always prided himself on being able to compartmentalize his feelings, to keep his emotions at bay, and focus on the task at hand. But now, in the quiet of the store, something was unraveling inside him. His thoughts, once so sharp and laser-focused, had become clouded with uncertainty. For the first time in years, Richard was questioning the very foundation of his life, his ambition, his drive, and the ruthless pursuit of personal success that had come to define him. For the first time in years, he found himself wanting something more. But what was it? What did he truly want? Was it the same things he had always sought? Money, power, influence? Or was there something deeper, something more meaningful that had been buried beneath his endless drive to succeed? Richard wasn't sure. The questions felt foreign, even unsettling, as if they didn't belong in the world he had created for himself. He had always been so focused on the external, on acquisitions, on climbing the corporate ladder, on gaining the approval of his peers, that he had never given much thought to the internal, to the way his actions affected others, or to the impact his choices had on the world around him. But now, the echo of the veteran's words rang in his ears, and he couldn't help but wonder whether there was more to life than what he had been chasing. He had everything he could ever want, and yet, in that moment, it felt like nothing at all. The world of luxury, success, and control had grown hollow, like an empty shell he had been clinging to without realizing it. The more he thought about it, the more the need for validation, the hunger for approval from those in his elite circle, seemed to lose its hold on him. The things that once defined him were suddenly meaningless. As Richard walked to his car, he found himself thinking not about the next big business deal or the yacht trip to the Mediterranean, but about the old man's eyes. There was a depth in those eyes that Richard hadn't seen in a long time. He had always been surrounded by people who had a purpose, a desire to climb higher, to succeed, to gain. But the veteran? He had no such desires. He was no longer chasing anything. He had lived a life full of experiences, struggles, and sacrifices, and now he was simply trying to get by. Richard's desire to have it all felt less important now, more distant, like something he no longer needed. Still, the question of what he truly wanted remained unanswered. Richard wasn't sure he could even articulate what that desire was. He had everything materialistic that he had ever wanted. Yet something about his encounter with the veteran, something about the kindness and humanity in the old man's actions, made Richard yearn for something more, something beyond the walls of his gated community and the glass skyscrapers of his business empire. It wasn't enough to simply have things anymore. He wanted connection. He wanted to feel something real, something authentic, something beyond the shallow interactions of business and luxury. Perhaps Richard thought he wanted redemption. He had always prided himself on being self-sufficient, but now the thought of reaching out, of making amends with the world he had so often overlooked, felt like a necessary next step in his journey. The problem was that he wasn't sure where to begin. But there was something else stirring inside him. 2. A desire to atone, to make things right somehow, to help others in a way that was not tied to his personal gain or benefit, but simply because it was the right thing to do. This thought, this newfound desire, began to settle in Richard's mind as he sat in the back of his sleek, black limousine, heading back to his high-rise. What if, he wondered, he could use his wealth to make a difference? What if he could give back, not as a way of showing off, but because it truly mattered? And what if, just maybe, he could build a legacy that wasn't defined by business mergers and financial triumphs, but by the way he had touched the lives of others? The more Richard thought about it, the more the idea seemed both thrilling and terrifying. It was a challenge, a kind of vulnerability he wasn't used to. For years, he had kept himself insulated from anything that might show him the flaws in his own character, the parts of himself that he had kept buried. But the old man's kindness, his quiet dignity in the face of hardship, had cracked open something inside Richard that had long been dormant. The man had offered him something Richard hadn't realized he was missing: perspective. And now, for the first time, Richard was beginning to want something far deeper than wealth or success. He wanted to feel whole. He wanted to feel that he mattered, not just for what he had, but for who he was. As he looked out of the limo window at the city below, Richard couldn't help but wonder, was it too late to change? Would it be possible to step out of his bubble of wealth and privilege and into a life that had meaning beyond the dollar signs and the endless pursuit of more? These were questions that Richard had never dared ask before. But today they had begun to take root, and they would not be so easily ignored. Richard Manning had spent the majority of his adult life at the summit of success, basking in the rewards of his ambition and ruthless work ethic. At 64, he was everything he had set out to become: wealthy, powerful, and influential. From his towering office on the 50th floor of his company's headquarters in downtown Miami to the sprawling penthouse he called home, Richard lived in a world that was entirely his own. His days were filled with meetings, decisions, and negotiations that shaped industries. Every detail of his life was orchestrated, down to the personal trainer he saw 3 times a week, the chauffeur-driven car he used to commute, and the high-end grocery deliveries he received twice a week to ensure his well-being. He was a man of control, and his world was precisely what he wanted it to be. In all his years of success, Richard had convinced himself that he was living the ideal life. He had everything: luxury homes in multiple countries, fast cars, designer clothes, and friends who could benefit him in ways he deemed valuable. The idea of wanting anything more had never occurred to him. Richard's desires were always transactional, rooted in tangible outcomes: new acquisitions, expanding his empire, increasing his wealth. He had reached the pinnacle of what society valued, and that was enough. In his mind, those who didn't share his ambition or drive were simply not capable of seeing life the way it should be. They had to be content with their place in the world, just as he had been content with his. For years, Richard lived in a state of constant motion. He was always planning the next big business deal, strategizing his next move. He rarely thought about anything outside the realm of work. Family and relationships were secondary to him. The few friendships he had were superficial, built on mutual interest and the promise of future success. His social circle consisted mainly of people in the same rarefied air: fellow entrepreneurs, top executives, financial magnates, all playing the same game. But that day, as Richard moved through the aisles of the small grocery store near his Miami apartment, something began to shift. Something he wasn't quite able to identify at first, but that would soon force him to question everything he had built his life around. The moment that planted the seed of doubt was so small that Richard nearly dismissed it at first. He had been briskly walking through the store, focused on his task of picking up a few simple items, something to eat for the next few days, some produce, milk, bread, when he had crossed paths with an elderly man, a veteran, struggling with his bags. Richard had barely noticed the man at first, absorbed in his own thoughts, until the veteran's voice had broken through his focus. "Excuse me, son," the old man had called, clearly trying to get his attention. Richard had momentarily paused, his eyes glancing up without really registering who the person was. He had no time for small talk, certainly not with someone he considered beneath his station. The elderly man was standing at the end of the aisle, holding a plastic bag that seemed too heavy for his frail hands. His clothes were worn, not the expensive suits Richard was accustomed to, but simple, practical, and a little threadbare. His face was etched with age and hardship, and he seemed to be having trouble balancing his load. Richard had looked at him briefly, then continued down the aisle, brushing past without a second thought. His mind was occupied with the more important things: the investor meeting he had scheduled in a few hours, the stock market updates, the latest reports from his company. The old man, just another face in the crowd, didn't register as anything more than an obstacle to be avoided. But then something unexpected happened. Richard's wallet, fat with cash and credit cards, slipped from his pocket unnoticed and landed softly on the linoleum floor. Richard hadn't felt the drop, and when he finally glanced down, it was the elderly man, the same one he had just brushed past, who had picked it up. The veteran's hand, weathered and slow, was extending the wallet toward Richard. The sudden realization of his mistake struck Richard like a bolt of lightning. He hadn't been kind to the man. He hadn't shown any concern for the elderly man's apparent struggles. And yet here he was, offering help, extending a simple gesture of goodwill. Richard reached for the wallet, taking it from the veteran with a murmured thanks. The old man didn't say much, just a quiet, "No problem, son," before stepping back. Richard barely registered the words, still caught in the strange moment of his own awkwardness. He had never been one to think about helping others, especially not people like this. But as the veteran turned away and shuffled off, Richard couldn't help but feel a slight pang of discomfort. It was the first time in a long time that Richard had been confronted by his own indifference. It wasn't just the fact that he had ignored the man's struggles. What bothered him more was that he had never even noticed. In his world, people were either important or irrelevant, and the elderly man with his slow gait and humble appearance had fallen squarely into that irrelevant category. But that day, the veteran's words, so simple, so soft, had planted a seed in Richard's mind. "It's not often I get to help someone, especially someone like you." The comment lingered in Richard's mind long after he had left the store. What did the veteran mean by that? Someone like you. Richard couldn't shake the thought. The old man had seen something in him, something that Richard wasn't sure he fully understood. What did it mean to be someone like you? Was it his wealth, his power, his sense of entitlement? Was that how the world saw him? It was a question that rattled around in Richard's mind throughout the rest of the afternoon. The more he thought about it, the more unsettled he became. The old man had been kind to him, and Richard had done nothing to deserve that kindness. In fact, he had acted with an indifference that now seemed almost cruel. The realization stung. For the first time in years, Richard began to question the life he had built, the life that had been focused almost entirely on his own success and comfort. Had he been so blinded by his own ambition that he had failed to notice the world around him? Was this all there was? At first, Richard dismissed the thought. He had everything he could want, didn't he? He had money, influence, a powerful career, and a lifestyle that most people could only dream of. What more could he need? What was the point of questioning it now? But then he thought about the veteran again, the frail man who had given him a small gift of grace in the midst of Richard's indifference. The veteran had shown him something important, something that Richard had ignored for most of his life. That kindness wasn't transactional. It didn't come with strings attached, and it wasn't something you gave only when you stood to gain something in return. The veteran's gesture was a reminder that there was more to life than wealth and success, more than the never-ending pursuit of more. It was a reminder that there was humanity in the world, something Richard had forgotten in his quest for dominance and achievement. As Richard sat in his office later that afternoon, preparing for a meeting with a potential client, his thoughts kept drifting back to the grocery store. The veteran's words echoed in his mind. "Someone like you." The phrase had stopped him cold, and he found himself asking, "Who am I really?" He was no longer sure he had the answer. The next few days passed in a blur of meetings and phone calls, but the unease didn't dissipate. Richard found himself distracted, his thoughts drifting to the older man every time he was alone. It was as if the encounter had unearthed something in him, something he had buried for years. His wealth, his career, his success. All of these things that had once defined him now seemed strangely hollow. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that his desire for more, for success, for recognition, for power, had come at a cost. He had isolated himself, built walls around his life that kept him from connecting with others, from seeing the world through a lens of empathy rather than calculation. For the first time in a long time, Richard found himself wanting something different. He wanted to feel. He wanted to connect. He wanted to experience life in a way that wasn't governed by the pursuit of self-interest. But what did that look like? How did someone like him change? Could he even change? These questions consumed him, pushing aside his usual focus on the bottom line. In the back of his mind, he felt a longing to break free from the constraints of his carefully constructed life and explore what it meant to live with a deeper sense of purpose. This was the beginning of a shift, though Richard didn't know it yet. He had spent a lifetime chasing the wrong kind of fulfillment, one based on external achievements rather than internal growth. But the encounter with the elderly veteran had awakened something dormant in him. For the first time, Richard was confronting the desire for something more meaningful than wealth or prestige. And as the days passed, he couldn't ignore the pull of this new, unfamiliar longing. It was an urge for change, for redemption, and for a life that transcended his previous understanding of success. Richard Manning wasn't used to feeling unsure about anything. In fact, in his entire life, he had become almost immune to uncertainty. Every decision he made was calculated, every risk meticulously weighed. He was a man who thrived on control, on the power of knowing exactly how the world operated and what he needed to do to navigate it. His rise to the top had been built on an ability to see beyond the obvious, to act decisively and without hesitation. But for the first time in years, Richard found himself standing on the precipice of something he didn't understand. The feeling that had been slowly building since his brief encounter with the elderly veteran in the grocery store had now blossomed into a full-fledged restlessness, gnawing at him as he sat in his office. His usual approach, keeping busy, moving from one project to the next, wasn't working anymore. It was as if something inside him was demanding attention, calling him to do something different, something that would push him outside of the carefully constructed life he had created. And yet, he had no idea where to start. He couldn't stop thinking about the old man, the veteran, who had shown him such simple kindness. That moment, brief as it had been, had somehow pierced the fortress Richard had spent his life building around himself. There was a certain humility to the man, a quiet dignity that Richard had never really encountered before, certainly not in his world of high-rise buildings and expensive suits. The veteran wasn't chasing anything, not fame, not wealth, not influence. He wasn't concerned with success or power. And that was what had troubled Richard so deeply. The contrast between the veteran's groundedness and Richard's own restlessness, a restlessness that now felt increasingly shallow. What did it mean to want something more than success? What did it mean to be present in a world that had always prized achievement above all else? These were questions Richard had never had to face before. In his world, wanting more was always a matter of doing more deals, more investments, more acquisitions. But here, in the silence of his thoughts, he realized that the more he was craving was something entirely different. It wasn't about acquiring more things, but about reconnecting with the world in a way he had never allowed himself to. For the first time in his life, Richard wasn't sure where to turn. He tried to push the thoughts aside, telling himself that he had too many responsibilities to indulge in these distractions. There were deadlines to meet, shareholders to impress, and a company to run. But no matter how hard he focused on the task at hand, he couldn't shake the sense that something was missing, something that his wealth, his success, and his control could not fill. He found himself thinking of the veteran's tired eyes, his deliberate actions. There was a kind of peace in the way the old man had moved, unhurried and unburdened by the frantic pursuit of status. Richard wondered, for the first time, if he had been chasing the wrong things. So, Richard did something he had never done before. He decided to step outside of his comfort zone. He had always been a creature of habit, someone who lived by a strict routine. His days were regimented, his time scheduled to the minute. But now, for reasons he couldn't fully explain, he felt compelled to do something different. He decided that he would try to understand what it was like to be in the veteran's shoes, to live in a way that wasn't defined by the endless pursuit of personal success. He had no idea where this would lead or what he was even looking for, but it didn't matter. For the first time, the destination seemed irrelevant. What mattered was the act of doing something new. The next morning, Richard woke up early. He had always been someone who got up at the same time every day, went through the same routine of exercise, breakfast, and then straight into the workday. But today, he broke that routine. He skipped the gym, got dressed casually, and decided to spend the day volunteering at a local food bank. It wasn't something he had ever considered before. Volunteering was not something people in his circle did. In his world, charity was often a transactional affair, donations made for tax benefits or public relations. But today, Richard was looking for something more authentic, something that didn't come with strings attached. When he arrived at the food bank, he felt out of place. The building was small, not the kind of place he was accustomed to visiting. The air was thick with the scent of canned goods, and the walls were lined with shelves holding food donations. There were people moving about, some staff, some volunteers sorting through boxes and preparing bags for those in need. Richard stood at the entrance for a moment, unsure of what to do next. He was used to giving orders, not receiving them. He had never been in a situation where he was the one who didn't know what was expected of him. A woman, perhaps in her late 40s, approached him. She wore a simple shirt and jeans, her face friendly but weathered. She introduced herself as Marissa, the food bank coordinator. "Hi, you must be Richard. Thanks for coming out today. We could use all the help we can get." Richard nodded awkwardly, feeling the weight of his unfamiliarity with the situation. "Of course. I'm happy to help," he said, though the words felt strange coming from his mouth. It wasn't that he wasn't willing to help. It was just that he had never put himself in a position where he didn't have control. "Great," Marissa said with a smile. "We're short on hands today. If you'd like, you can help with packing food boxes for the families. We try to make sure everyone gets what they need, but sometimes it's a bit chaotic." Richard agreed, still feeling somewhat uncomfortable, and followed her to a large table where volunteers were organizing food items into boxes. It was simple work, straightforward and unremarkable, but as Richard began sorting cans of beans, bags of rice, and boxes of pasta into the designated boxes, something began to shift inside him. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was part of something that mattered, not because of his wealth, not because of his position, but simply because he was there, doing something for others without expecting anything in return. As the day wore on, Richard found himself falling into the rhythm of the work. He was no longer thinking about the deals waiting on his desk or the meetings he had scheduled. Instead, he focused on the task in front of him, placing a can of peas in a box, then a package of cereal, then a bag of flour. The work was repetitive, but there was something meditative about it, something that helped him stop the constant buzzing in his mind. He began to feel a sense of peace, one he hadn't experienced in years. Around noon, Marissa brought him some lunch, and they sat down together to eat. As they ate, she told him more about the food bank and the people they served. She explained that many of the families were struggling just to get by, and some had lost jobs due to economic downturns. There were elderly people who couldn't afford to buy groceries, single mothers who worked 2 jobs and still couldn't make ends meet, and veterans like the one Richard had seen at the store. The same kind of people who had sacrificed for the country, but now lived in poverty. Richard listened, not just with his ears, but with a new kind of attention. The veteran's words came back to him. "It's not often I get to help someone, especially someone like you." Now, Richard understood what the veteran had meant. Someone like you. The words were not about status, wealth, or power. They were about the ways in which people moved through the world. Richard had been someone who never had to ask for help, someone who had always been on the receiving end of others' gestures of respect and admiration. But here, in this food bank, he was nothing more than another volunteer, just one person helping others. There was no hierarchy. There was no status. There was only the simple act of helping, of giving. By the end of the day, Richard was exhausted but strangely fulfilled. He had done something new, something that was outside his usual realm of experience. The sense of accomplishment he felt wasn't tied to a business deal or a financial success. It was tied to the act of serving others, of being present in a way that he had never allowed himself to be before. The work itself wasn't glamorous or exciting, but it had given him a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging. As Richard left the food bank that day, his mind was swirling with thoughts. He realized he had entered an unfamiliar situation, not just in terms of physical location, but in terms of his very mindset. He had stepped outside the world of power and achievement and into the world of compassion and service, and for the first time in a long time, it felt right. The world wasn't about getting ahead anymore. It was about being part of something bigger than oneself. And in that moment, Richard felt a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The days following Richard's first volunteer experience at the food bank were difficult. He had expected the experience to be transformative, but what he didn't anticipate was how much his life would begin to feel unmoored. For the first time in years, the sense of control that he had spent a lifetime cultivating seemed out of reach. He had stepped into a world where he was not the expert, where he didn't have the answers, and, worse, where he couldn't rely on his usual methods of achieving success. He had thought that volunteering, even for just a day, would be a singular event, something he could tick off a list and then return to his real life. But that was before he had started to see how his values, his habits, and his sense of identity had begun to unravel. Richard had always been someone who prided himself on being in charge, on knowing how to get things done. But at the food bank, he was just another volunteer. He had to wait for directions, follow instructions, and be part of a team. There was no CEO title here, no prestigious meetings to attend. There was just the raw reality of service, helping those who were less fortunate with no strings attached. For the first few weeks, Richard struggled to find his footing in this unfamiliar world. The simplicity of the work felt, at times, like a slap in the face. He had spent years navigating high-stakes business deals, where every decision he made had the potential to affect millions of dollars and the livelihoods of countless employees. Yet here he was sorting cans, packing boxes, and cleaning floors. It was hard for him to reconcile this with the life he had been living. He couldn't help but feel like he was wasting his time. But there was something about the experience that kept drawing him back. Every time Richard walked into the food bank, it felt like a small personal rebellion. He was, in a sense, turning his back on the world he had built. But as much as he struggled with the dissonance, he began to notice subtle changes in himself. He became more patient. He started listening to the stories of the people he worked alongside, other volunteers, many of whom were from entirely different walks of life than his own. There were college students who volunteered to give back to the community, retirees who wanted to stay active, and young mothers who had once relied on food banks themselves and now wanted to help others who were struggling. Richard started to realize that they all had something in common. They had seen hardship up close and chose to act, to give their time and energy for something greater than themselves. At first, Richard had been hesitant to share anything about his own background. He had never felt the need to explain who he was or where he came from. His wealth and position in life had always spoken for themselves. But as he spent more time in the food bank, he found himself opening up more, finding a strange camaraderie with the other volunteers. He no longer felt the need to hide behind his wealth or his title. The very thing that had defined him for so long, his success, began to lose its grip on him. Instead of standing apart, looking down from his position of power, Richard started to feel like he was part of something bigger, a team that was working together for a common purpose. Yet, even as Richard adapted to this new environment, it was not without its challenges. His sense of isolation lingered, especially during moments when he had to confront the stark realities of the people he was helping. The stories of the families who came to the food bank for help were often heartbreaking. There were mothers with children, struggling to feed their families after losing jobs in the recent economic downturn. There were seniors on fixed incomes, unable to make ends meet. There were veterans, much like the man Richard had seen in the store, who had given everything for their country but found themselves abandoned by the very system they had served. One of the most difficult moments came when Richard met a man named George, a former mechanic who had lost his job and, with it, his house. George was in his mid-50s and he looked older than his years. His hands were calloused from years of hard work, but his eyes were tired of trying to survive, tired of being passed over by a society that no longer had room for him. He had come to the food bank looking for something to feed his family, but his pride kept him from asking directly. Instead, he stood at the counter, glancing over the canned goods as if he had no right to take them. Richard was the one who spoke to him, offering him a box of food. The exchange was brief, but it stuck with Richard. He had seen people like George before, people whose lives had unraveled due to forces outside their control. It was a humbling experience for Richard. He had lived in a bubble of success for so long that it was difficult for him to fully comprehend the depth of the struggles that people like George faced. And yet, there was a moment, just a brief one, when George looked at him with gratitude in his eyes. It wasn't the kind of gratitude Richard was used to receiving, the forced thankfulness of someone who wanted something from him. It was a genuine expression of thanks, born from the simple realization that someone cared enough to help, even when there was no expectation of anything in return. It was in these moments of connection that Richard began to feel the first stirrings of change. The work itself wasn't glamorous, but the interactions with the people who came to the food bank for help were starting to shift something deep inside him. He had spent so much of his life measuring success in terms of power, money, and status, but now he was learning that true success wasn't about what you accumulated. It was about what you gave. But this shift wasn't easy. Richard faced resistance, both from within himself and from the people around him. He struggled to balance his old life with the new reality he was confronting. His colleagues at the company didn't understand why he was spending so much time at the food bank. They were used to seeing him as the consummate businessman, the one who always knew how to make a deal and keep everything running smoothly. But now, Richard found himself avoiding conversations about work. His heart wasn't in it anymore. There were moments when he wondered if he was throwing away everything he had built, but those moments were fleeting. They were quickly replaced with a sense of peace, a peace he hadn't felt in years. One afternoon, as Richard was preparing food boxes with another volunteer named Emily, he found himself talking about his past in a way he never had before. Emily was a college student, earnest and bright, who had been volunteering at the food bank for several months. She had a natural optimism about her, and her energy was infectious. She asked Richard how he had come to volunteer, and for the first time, Richard told her about his career, his rise to success, and the way he had started to feel lost in it all. Emily listened attentively, not judging, just nodding as he spoke. When he finished, she said something that struck him deeply. "You know, Mr. Manning, sometimes we get so focused on climbing the ladder that we forget to look around. We forget that the people we pass on the way up might need us. They might be the very people who help us realize what really matters." Richard didn't have an answer for her right away, but he realized she was right. He had been so focused on getting to the top that he hadn't stopped to see the people around him, the ones who needed help, the ones who had struggled while he had soared. He had been so consumed with his own success that he had never considered that perhaps true success meant lifting others up along the way. It was during these moments of reflection that Richard began to let go of his old, rigid beliefs about what mattered. It wasn't an easy process. It wasn't as simple as making a few donations or volunteering for a day. It required a deeper transformation, a shift in his worldview. He had to confront his own arrogance, his own pride, and the toxic belief that he was somehow better than the people he was now serving. He had to learn that value is not determined by one's bank account or job title. The value of a person came from the way they treated others, from their ability to show kindness and compassion in a world that so often lacked both. Richard began to adapt to his new life, slowly but surely. He still spent time at the food bank, but he also began to reconnect with people in his personal life, friends, family, colleagues, on a deeper level. He found himself asking more questions, listening more attentively, and looking for ways to help others, not just with money or resources, but with time and attention. He realized that, for all his wealth, there was something he had been missing all along: connection. The transformation wasn't immediate, and it wasn't perfect. There were setbacks. There were moments of doubt. But Richard had taken the first step, and in that step, he had started to break free from the old habits that had defined his life. He was beginning to see the world through a new lens, not one of power or status, but one of humility and service. And with each passing day, Richard learned more about the person he was becoming. The weeks that followed Richard's increased involvement at the food bank felt like a slow awakening, a gradual breaking down of the old walls he had so carefully constructed around himself. He began spending more time volunteering and less time on the corporate grind. At first, this shift was subtle. He'd still go into the office, still attend meetings, still answer emails. But his focus had shifted. More and more, Richard found himself thinking about the people he had met at the food bank, the families who struggled to make ends meet, the elderly veterans who stood in line for food, the single mothers who showed up with their children in tow. He began to see the world through a lens he had never looked through before, a lens of need, not of success. Despite the turmoil he felt inside, this conflict between the person he had been and the person he was beginning to be, Richard took pride in his ability to keep his personal transformation separate from his professional life. His colleagues at the office noticed nothing unusual. Richard was still the same impeccably dressed, sharp, and efficient businessman who closed deals without hesitation. No one suspected that he was spending his free time at the food bank, or that he was having deep conversations with the volunteers about the value of service, kindness, and community. He had become adept at compartmentalizing his life, at keeping his new reality tucked away from the high-stakes world of corporate maneuvering. One day, after a particularly grueling meeting, Richard was walking through the office lobby when he bumped into a familiar face, Carl, one of the company's senior executives. Carl was a longtime associate and a close friend, someone who had always admired Richard's drive and ambition. Carl had been with the company from the very beginning and had seen Richard grow from a young, eager entrepreneur into the powerful figure he had become today. They exchanged pleasantries, and Carl, ever the businessman, quickly asked about a new project Richard had been working on. Richard felt the familiar pull of the corporate world, the one that always urged him to talk about profit margins, market share, and the next big deal. For a moment, he felt the rush of pride he used to get when discussing his company's success. He found himself eagerly detailing the latest acquisition and the numbers they were projected to bring in. As he spoke, Carl's eyes lit up with approval, and Richard could see that familiar admiration in his colleague's face, the same look that had once made him feel invincible. "You're doing amazing things, Richard," Carl said, clapping him on the back. "The company's in great hands. We've come a long way since the early days. You're killing it." Richard smiled, feeling the satisfaction of being recognized for his success. But as the words left Carl's mouth, a strange sensation washed over him. It was the same sense of emptiness he had started to feel in the past few weeks, this hollow victory that always seemed to come after a triumph. Yes, the numbers were impressive, and yes, his colleagues respected him. But there was something missing, something deeper that the accolades could not touch. Richard had always believed that professional success was the pinnacle of a meaningful life, that achievement was the measure of a person's worth. But now, as Carl praised him for his accomplishments, Richard couldn't help but feel that the praise was meaningless. It was like a script he had memorized and delivered over and over again, but it no longer resonated with him. Carl's words echoed in his mind, but they quickly lost their power. Killing it. Was that really all there was to it? Was he really killing it? Or was he just playing a part in a larger game? One where success and failure were merely numbers on a spreadsheet, with no real connection to the people whose lives they impacted? He thought back to the faces of the families he had met at the food bank, to the veterans who had lost their homes, to the children who came in with their mothers, hungry and afraid. Those people didn't care about his corporate victories. They didn't care about how many deals he had closed or how much money he had made. They cared about the basics: food, shelter, safety, and love. As Carl walked away, Richard felt a deep sense of conflict. His need for validation, for recognition, had been so ingrained in him for so long that he hadn't even realized how much it defined his identity. But now, standing in the sterile, corporate lobby of his company, the realization struck him hard. What had he been working for all these years? What was the point of the prestige, the power, and the wealth if they didn't bring him happiness? He had spent so long striving for the next big achievement, the next financial milestone, that he had neglected to ask himself whether it was what he truly wanted. For a moment, Richard considered walking away from the office, from the company, from everything he had built. He thought about the food bank and the sense of purpose he had found there, the connections he had made with people who had nothing to give except their time, their gratitude, and their stories. He thought about the veteran at the store, the man who had helped him pick up his wallet and had asked for nothing in return. He thought about how different that encounter had been from the transactional relationships he was used to, relationships where every action had a price and every favor had a return. The contrast between the two worlds felt sharper than ever. And yet, despite these realizations, Richard continued to play the game. He continued to put in the long hours at the office, to make deals and close contracts. The food bank became a secondary concern, a place he visited only when he could squeeze in a few hours on weekends. He told himself that the real work was still happening at the company, that his influence and success could bring about the kind of change he wanted. Perhaps, he thought, he could find a way to merge his business acumen with the ideals he had come to admire at the food bank. Maybe he could use his resources to build a philanthropic arm of the company, one that could serve the people in need, just as the food bank did. But as he threw himself back into the rhythm of corporate life, something began to feel off. The satisfaction he once felt in negotiating contracts and overseeing business operations began to wane. His focus was fractured, and the urgency he once felt to achieve the next milestone became less consuming. In its place, there was a growing sense of unease, a feeling that no matter how successful he became, it would never fill the emptiness he now saw in the corporate world. The work he was doing felt less meaningful with every passing day. One afternoon, Richard sat in his office, staring out the window at the city skyline. He was reviewing some reports, but his mind wasn't on the numbers. He was thinking about a recent conversation he had had with Marissa, the food bank coordinator. She had told him that the food bank was struggling to keep up with the growing demand. More families were showing up every day, and they simply didn't have enough resources to provide for everyone. It was a sobering conversation, one that had stayed with him. The food bank was a lifeline for so many people, and yet it was always running on the edge, always struggling to meet the needs of the community. Richard had made a donation to the food bank several weeks ago, a sizable one. It had felt good to write the check, to know that his money was going to help people. But now, as he sat there, he couldn't shake the feeling that his donation had been a way of placating his conscience, a way of feeling good about himself without really doing the hard work. Writing a check, he realized, wasn't enough. It wasn't the same as showing up, as connecting with the people you were trying to help, as being present in the struggle. In that moment, Richard understood something crucial. Giving money or making a donation wasn't enough to make a real difference. It wasn't about the amount of money he could donate or the number of people he could hire to run a corporate charity. It was about engaging with people, listening to their needs, and being part of a community that wasn't about personal gain or status. It was about giving without expecting anything in return, without the need for recognition or a pat on the back. But even as he understood this, Richard was still caught in the pull of his old life. He had gotten what he thought he wanted: professional success, recognition, and the ability to help others with his wealth. Yet, it hadn't led to the fulfillment he had hoped for. The victory, he now realized, was false. The accolades, the business deals, the money. None of it could give him the peace or satisfaction he sought. He had learned something important about what really mattered, but he wasn't yet ready to give up the life he had built. Richard had what he thought he wanted: success, wealth, and the admiration of his peers. But what he truly needed, was something different, something deeper, something that could not be measured in dollar signs or quarterly reports. It was the realization that his true impact on the world would not be defined by the deals he closed or the wealth he accumulated. It would be defined by the connections he made, the lives he touched, and the way he gave without expectation. And so, while Richard had achieved a certain kind of victory in his career, it had become increasingly clear that this was not the victory he truly sought. He had won the battle, but lost something much more precious in the process. Richard's life, once a clear-cut path to success, was now spiraling into a chaos of unanswered questions and unfulfilled desires. Though he had believed that achieving the corporate pinnacle, fame, wealth, recognition, would grant him peace, it had only deepened his inner turmoil. The victories he had once sought so desperately now felt hollow and empty, like empty shells washed ashore. And yet, even with this growing realization, Richard was not ready to let go. He couldn't let go. The pull of success, the drive to win, was still deeply embedded in him, like a drug that had long since stopped giving him a high, but remained addictive nonetheless. After a particularly grueling week of meetings, deadlines, and back-to-back calls, Richard found himself standing in his office, late one Friday evening, staring out of the massive windows of his penthouse corner office. The view of the city spread out beneath him, the skyscrapers lit up like a constellation, the streets teeming with life. From this height, everything seemed small, as though the problems that had been consuming him for months were nothing more than distant specks on a faraway horizon. Yet, in his heart, Richard knew the truth. Nothing was as far away as it seemed. His thoughts turned again to the food bank. The faces of the families, the veterans, the elderly widows, and young mothers who had asked for nothing but help echoed in his mind. But it wasn't just the people who had made an impact on him. It was the stark contrast between his world of power and privilege and there's people who lived day to day with a different set of rules. It was that juxtaposition that gnawed at him. He had everything and nothing at the same time. In the quiet solitude of his office, Richard found himself questioning the very nature of success. What was the point of all his wealth if it didn't bring him the fulfillment he had expected? What was the point of winning if the victories felt so unfulfilling? It was during these moments of doubt that he finally acknowledged the price he had paid for his so-called success. In his pursuit of career milestones, Richard had sacrificed something far more valuable: meaningful connection. The decision to leave the office that night had been a sudden one. Richard had stayed later than usual, working through the evening in an attempt to push past his inner conflict, but it had only deepened. He had thrown himself into his work so completely over the years that he had distanced himself from everyone, his colleagues, his friends, and even his family. But most painfully of all, he had distanced himself from the one person who had once mattered more than anyone, his wife, Julia. Richard had met Julia in the early days of his career, when he was just starting to climb the ladder. She had been his rock, steady, grounded, and always able to pull him back when his ambition threatened to carry him away. She had seen the man behind the power, the one who was still uncertain, still searching for a place in the world. Julia had understood him in a way that no one else did, and he had always felt that if there was one person who could help him find himself again, it was her. But somewhere along the way, their connection had frayed. Richard had thrown himself so completely into his work that he neglected to nurture their relationship. The late nights, the business trips, the meetings, and the constant drive for more had pushed Julia to the sidelines of his life. The irony wasn't lost on Richard. He had spent all these years building an empire, but in doing so, he had lost the people who truly mattered. His wealth had given him power, status, and comfort, but it had come at the cost of his most important relationships. The truth was, he had used his career as a shield, protecting himself from the vulnerability of real emotional connection. It was easier to focus on deals and numbers than to confront the emotional complexities of love and intimacy. His marriage had become a shadow of what it once was. They had grown distant, communicating more through passive-aggressive comments and awkward silences than through the open dialogue that had once characterized their relationship. Julia had stopped asking about his day, knowing it would always be the same, a recounting of corporate victories, acquisitions, and profit margins. She had had expecting him to be home for dinner, and over time, she had stopped trying to be a part of his world. And Richard, for his part, had done little to change it. The more distant they became, the more he buried himself in work. It was easier that way, less painful. But now, as he sat alone in his office, the weight of his choices settled over him. The price of success had been steep, and Richard had finally begun to see that. It wasn't the money, the power, or the accolades that mattered. It was the people he had left behind, the people who had truly cared about him, the people who had once been the heart of his life. Without thinking, Richard grabbed his coat and walked out of his office. He didn't know exactly where he was going, but he knew he needed to face the consequences of his actions. The world outside was cold, the streets empty, and still under the late-night haze of neon lights. He felt like a man adrift from his past, his future, and from the life he had once believed he would lead. Richard's first stop was his home. His penthouse apartment, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a prison. He had built it as a sanctuary, a place where he could escape the pressures of the world. But tonight it felt hollow and foreign. Julia's absence hung in the air, an unspoken reminder of how far they had drifted apart. He had not called her that evening. He had not reached out to her in days. He had simply let the distance grow between them, and now it felt insurmountable. He entered the apartment, the door creaking as it opened. The lights were dim, and the silence was deafening. Julia wasn't home. As usual, she had left hours ago, retreating to her own life while he buried himself in his. He wasn't angry at her. He knew that he had done this to their relationship. His inability to connect, his relentless focus on work, had driven a wedge between them that no amount of money or success could repair. Richard sat down in the living room, the weight of his actions sinking in. He realized, perhaps for the first time, how truly alone he was. The people who had once cheered for his success, his colleagues, his investors, his friends, were not the people who mattered. The people who mattered were those who had been by his side when everything was uncertain, when he was still learning, still growing, still trying to figure out what he wanted out of life. It was Julia, who had believed in him even when he couldn't believe in himself. It was the veterans at the food bank, who had given their lives for their country and were now living in the margins of society. It was the children whose mothers struggled to feed them, whose futures seemed uncertain. Richard's thoughts turned back to the food bank. He had thought, for a while, that a simple financial donation would be enough to soothe his conscience. But now he understood that it wasn't enough. Money could feed people, but it couldn't heal the wounds of a broken society. It couldn't restore dignity to the people who had lost everything. It couldn't bring families back together. At that moment, Richard realized that he had been living in a bubble of privilege, disconnected from the realities of the world around him. The life he had built, with all its trappings of success, had come at the cost of everything that truly mattered. He had wanted power, wealth, and recognition, and he had gotten all of those things. But they hadn't filled the emptiness inside him. In fact, they had only deepened it. He needed something more. He needed to reconnect, to rebuild what he had lost. And the first step, he realized, was to reach out to the person he had hurt the most, Julia. He wasn't sure if she would welcome him back, but he knew that he couldn't keep running from the consequences of his choices. Richard picked up his phone and dialed her number. His hands shook as he waited for her to answer, but when she did, her voice on the other end was soft, distant. She had clearly been waiting for this moment, waiting for him to make the first move. He had failed her for too long, and he knew that he might never be able to repair the damage.
But he was willing to try.
"I'm sorry, Julia," he said, his voice breaking. "I've been so focused on the wrong things. I've neglected you, neglected us. I don't know if I can make it right, but I'm ready to try. I don't want to lose you." For a long moment, there was silence on the other end of the line. Richard's heart pounded in his chest, but then, slowly, Julia spoke. "We'll talk, Richard. We'll talk." It wasn't an answer, but it was a start. It was the beginning of the healing process, a small, tentative step toward rebuilding everything he had lost. Richard understood now that real success wasn't about accolades or wealth. It was about the relationships you built, the people you loved, and the way you lived in the world. He had paid a heavy price for his ignorance, but he was ready to change. He was ready to learn what really mattered. The week that followed Richard's late-night conversation with Julia felt like a blur, a series of emotional highs and lows, revelations, and realizations that shook him to his core. His first few attempts at rebuilding the fragile bridge between him and his wife were clumsy, tentative, and filled with the uncomfortable tension that often accompanies the confrontation of past mistakes. But as the days passed, something inside Richard shifted. The sharpness of his regret dulled, and in its place grew a quiet resolve to live differently, to be different. He began the process of making amends, not just with Julia, but with himself. For years, Richard had believed that his worth was tied to the external validation of success, fame, power, and fortune. But now, as he found himself mending the relationships he had neglected, he realized that his sense of worth came from within. It was not defined by the boardrooms or the city skyline, or even the achievements he had so carefully stacked up over the years. His worth was shaped by how he showed up for the people who mattered, how he acted with integrity, how he was present in the lives of those who loved him. Richard's journey to rediscover himself was, in many ways, a return to the basics. It was about reconnecting with the simple, human truths he had long ignored, the importance of love, of vulnerability, of selflessness. It was about stepping away from the relentless drive to achieve and learning to appreciate the quiet moments, the ones he had so often overlooked while he chased after something elusive and intangible. As he stepped into this new chapter of his life, Richard found that change wasn't something that could be neatly compartmentalized into a single, dramatic moment. It was a slow, ongoing process, one that required consistent effort, patience, and a willingness to face uncomfortable truths. His first few attempts at reconnecting with Julia were awkward, almost painful. He tried to explain how much he had changed, how deeply he regretted the distance that had come between them, but words felt inadequate. Julia listened, and for the first time in a long while, Richard could sense that she was actually hearing him. But she was guarded, understandably so. She had been hurt by his neglect, and the scars from their years of emotional disconnection weren't so easily erased. Julia didn't offer easy forgiveness. She didn't pretend that everything could be fixed overnight. She took things one day at a time, and Richard respected that. He knew that change would take time, and that rebuilding trust, something he had so carelessly broken, wasn't something that could be rushed. But there was progress, however small. They began talking more, spending time together again, reestablishing the bond they once had. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. For the first time in years, Richard was spending his weekends in a way he hadn't in a long time, with Julia. They would go for walks, visit farmers markets, or have lunch at the small cafe down the street. Sometimes they would sit in silence, simply enjoying each other's company. Other times, they would talk about the past, the mistakes, the pain, and the lost years. But there were also moments of laughter, moments where the old spark between them flickered back to life. It wasn't the passion of their early years, but something more grounded, more mature, something that was based on mutual respect and understanding rather than youthful exuberance. As Richard's relationship with Julia began to heal, he also began to reconsider his role at the company. His newfound sense of purpose, which had grown out of his time volunteering at the food bank and his desire to give back to his community, had made him realize that his work could no longer be the sole focus of his life. He was no longer the man who defined himself by the size of his paycheck or the number of deals he closed. He was someone different now, someone who understood that success was not just about the number of zeros at the end of his bank statement. Real success, he now realized, was about making a positive impact on the world around him, about using his privilege and resources to help others. Richard's decision to step down from his role as CEO of the company was not an easy one. It was a decision that had been brewing for months, even before his moment of clarity at the food bank. But now, as he sat in his office, surrounded by the same polished, immaculate furniture and the same view of the city that had once made him feel powerful. He knew it was time. He had come to understand that while he could still be a leader, it didn't have to be in the way he had once thought. He could lead differently, more authentically, by using his experience and resources to do good, to support causes he believed in, and to make the world a better place, even in small ways. The decision wasn't easy for everyone around him. His colleagues were surprised, some even shocked at his announcement. The company had grown exponentially under his leadership, and there were those who thought he was giving up too much. But Richard knew, deep down, that stepping away was the right thing to do. He had spent years in a constant cycle of ambition and achievement, and now it was time to step back and focus on what truly mattered. At the food bank, Richard's presence became more regular. He began attending board meetings, volunteering more hours, and even helping to organize fundraising events. His influence and resources helped secure more donations and expand the reach of the organization, but he never used his position to make himself the center of attention. It wasn't about recognition for him anymore. It was about the people who came to the food bank for help, the veterans, the children, the families who were struggling. It was about the collective good, about making a real difference in their lives. One Saturday afternoon, as Richard was helping to distribute food at the food bank, he encountered a young girl named Maria. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, but her eyes were full of a quiet wisdom that made Richard pause. She was with her mother, a single woman who worked multiple jobs to make ends meet. Maria smiled at Richard as he handed her a small bag of groceries, and in that moment, something inside him shifted again. It was the first time in a long while that Richard felt a sense of true fulfillment. The simple act of giving, of being present in this small, seemingly insignificant way, felt more meaningful than anything he had ever achieved in the boardroom. The smile on Maria's face, the gratitude in her eyes, was worth more than all the stock options and corporate accolades he had once pursued. For the first time in his life, Richard understood that true success wasn't about what you could accumulate, it was about what you could give. As he walked away from the food bank that afternoon, Richard felt lighter, freer than he had in years. He didn't have all the answers, and he knew that the road ahead would still be filled with challenges. But he also knew that he was on the right path. He had finally come to terms with the truth that had eluded him for so long. Success wasn't defined by external measures, but by the connections you made, the kindness you showed, and the way you made others feel. Back at home, Richard and Julia continued to rebuild their relationship. It was a work in progress, a slow but steady journey toward healing. Richard had no illusions that everything would be perfect, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was showing up in a way that mattered. He wasn't just going through the motions anymore, he was present, genuinely present in their relationship. They still had their differences, their moments of tension, but the love between them had returned, not in the form of passionate romance, but in the quiet understanding that they were both willing to fight for their relationship. Richard didn't know where this journey would lead, but he was no longer afraid of the uncertainty. He had learned that life wasn't about having all the answers or achieving a certain level of success. It was about living authentically, about being true to yourself and to those you love. He had found something far more precious than any corporate achievement: the ability to be real, to be human, and to connect with others in meaningful ways. As he looked out at the city skyline once more, Richard understood that his life had changed forever. He had stepped out of his old world, one of ambition and power, and into a new one grounded in love, service, and connection. It wasn't always easy, and there were still many challenges ahead. But Richard was no longer the man he once was. He had found something more valuable than wealth, more enduring than success: peace. And that was enough.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.